Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the Third Crusade, one of history's most legendary holy wars that shaped the medieval world between 1189 and 1192. We'll softly explore the epic clash between Christian and Muslim forces, from the devastating Battle of Hattin that sparked this great expedition, to the heroic campaigns of Frederick Barbarossa, and finally the legendary confrontation between Richard the Lionheart and the great Saladin, all while the fate of Jerusalem hung in the balance. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about which medieval figure fascinates you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the age of chivalry lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Richard, later known as Richard the Lionheart, would become one of medieval Europe's most celebrated warrior kings, leading the most famous of all crusading expeditions to the Holy Land. Yet his legendary journey began not with his own ambitions, but with a catastrophic defeat that sent shockwaves across the Christian world. On a scorching July day in 1187, near the twin peaks known as the Horns of Hattin, the flower of Christian knighthood lay scattered across the Palestinian hills. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, led by Guy of Lusignan, had been utterly annihilated by the forces of Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. This disaster would set in motion the greatest military expedition of the medieval age. The Christian realm in the east had been crumbling for months. Saladin, that champion of Islam whose very name struck fear into Christian hearts, had been methodically reducing the Crusader strongholds one by one. In swift succession, the vital ports of Acre, Haifa, Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sidon fell to his disciplined armies. The once mighty Crusader states, established nearly a century earlier during the First Crusade, seemed on the verge of complete extinction. Most devastating of all was the fall of Jerusalem itself. In October 1187, after a brief siege, Balian of Ibelin surrendered the holy city to Saladin. Unlike the bloodbath that had accompanied the Christian conquest in 1099, Saladin's recapture was marked by remarkable restraint. Christians native to the city were permitted to remain, while others were safely escorted out, a testament to the Sultan's reputation for honorable conduct in warfare. Yet one crucial stronghold remained in Christian hands, the ancient port city of Tyre. It was here that fate would place an unlikely savior. Conrad of Montferrat, a Frankish nobleman from northern Italy, had been sailing toward the Holy Land aboard a Genoese vessel when news of the catastrophe reached him. This charismatic figure, whose exploits against the armies of Frederick Barbarossa had already brought him fame throughout Europe, now found himself thrust into the role of chief defender of what remained of Christian Palestine. Conrad's arrival at Tyre in mid-July 1187 could not have been more timely. With most of the Crusader leadership dead or captured at Hattin, this northern Italian noble emerged by pure chance as the principal Christian commander in the Levant. His first act was to immediately begin strengthening Tyre's already formidable defenses, for he knew that Saladin would not long delay in moving against this last major Christian stronghold. News of these catastrophic events traveled swiftly across the Mediterranean. When word reached Pope Urban III in Rome, the elderly pontiff allegedly collapsed and died from the shock of learning about Jerusalem's loss. His successor, Gregory VIII, wasted no time in responding to the crisis. On October 29, 1187, just 9 days after assuming the papal throne, he issued the bull, or Dita Tremendi, which called upon all of Christendom to take up the cross in a new holy war to reclaim the sacred city. The response across Europe was immediate and overwhelming. Despite the bitter memory of the disastrous Second Crusade in the 1140s, the loss of Jerusalem struck at the very heart of medieval Christian identity. Kings, nobles, and commoners alike began to contemplate the arduous journey to the east. Prince Richard of England, who would later earn immortal fame as the Lionheart, was among the first to respond. In a display of characteristic impetuosity, he took the crusading vow even before Gregory's papal bull had been officially promulgated. His enthusiasm would soon spread to the highest levels of European royalty. In France, the complex web of feudal politics initially complicated any unified response. King Philip II, later known as Philip Augustus, was locked in perpetual conflict with Richard's father, Henry II of England, over their competing claims to vast territories in France. Yet the arrival of Jocelyn, Archbishop of Tyre, would change everything. This churchman had travelled from the beleaguered Holy Land with a specific mission: to convince the two rival monarchs to set aside their differences and unite in the cause of Christ. The Archbishop's passionate appeals struck home. Both Henry II and Philip II committed themselves to the new crusade, agreeing to a revolutionary new form of financing known as the Saladin tithe. This unprecedented tax would levy a substantial burden on all their subjects to fund the expedition. Philip Dolces, Count of Flanders, soon joined this royal enterprise, bringing additional resources and prestige to the growing movement. Tragedy struck, however, before the expedition could properly begin. On July 6, 1189, King Henry II died, leaving his ambitious son Richard to inherit not only the crown of England, but also the sacred obligation to lead the English contingent in what would become known as the Third Crusade. Meanwhile, in the German lands, an even more prestigious figure was preparing to answer the papal call. Frederick Barbarossa, the aging but still formidable Holy Roman Emperor, took the cross in a ceremony at Mainz that would live long in memory. At 66 years of age, this veteran of countless campaigns committed the vast resources of the German Empire to the holy cause. In the East, Saladin was not idle during these months of Christian preparation. In the summer of 1188, he made a calculated decision to release Guy of Lusignan from captivity. The defeated king of Jerusalem swore a solemn oath never again to take up arms against the Sultan, an oath he would quickly and shamelessly betray. Guy gathered his family and remaining followers and made his way to Tripoli, where Balian of Ibelin had taken the Christian refugees from Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Conrad of Montferrat continued his heroic defense of Tyre, successfully withstanding a grueling 7-month siege by Saladin's forces. The Sultan, frustrated by his inability to take this last Christian stronghold, launched a campaign into Syria, systematically capturing city after city and fortress after fortress. By the summer of 1189, Guy had collected troops from both Tripoli and Antioch, assembling a new army with which he marched south toward Tyre. As the rightful ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he naturally expected Conrad to grant him entry to the city. Conrad, however, had other ideas. Having successfully defended Tyre through the darkest months of Christian defeat, he was not about to surrender control to a king whose incompetence had led to the disaster at Hattin. A fierce rivalry immediately developed between these two men, representing different visions for the future of the Crusader states. Conrad saw himself as the savior of Christian Palestine, while Guy clung to his royal prerogatives despite his military failures. This bitter feud would plague the Third Crusade. Throughout its duration, frustrated by his inability to enter Tyre, Guy made a decision that would alter the course of the entire war. In August 1189, he turned his army away from the impregnable port and marched south toward Acre. His plan was audacious: to recapture this vital city and establish it as his new base of operations, thereby proving his worthiness to lead the Christian cause. Guy's army was substantial for the reduced circumstances of the Crusader states. He commanded up to 700 knights and 9,000 infantry, a force that represented the largest Christian army assembled since the disaster at Hattin. To avoid the Muslim scouts who patrolled the interior roads, Guy chose to advance along the coastal route known as the Scandalian Pass, keeping close to the Mediterranean where Christian naval support might be available. Despite these precautions, the movement of such a large force could not long remain secret. Word quickly reached Saladin at his encampment at Belfer Castle. Curiously, the Sultan hesitated to respond immediately. Some chroniclers suggest he suspected Guy's march might be an elaborate ruse designed to lure him from his strong defensive position and render him vulnerable to attacks from multiple directions. Guy's forces eventually reached their destination without serious interference. Over the following days, additional contingents joined them, including a Pisan naval force that had chosen to sail rather than march. The Christians established their main camp on an ancient hill known as the Torren, ascending under cover of darkness. To avoid detection from this elevated position, Guy and his commanders enjoyed a clear view of both Acre and the surrounding plain. The location offered significant defensive advantages. The eastern slopes of the Torren were steep enough to prevent effective cavalry charges, while the western side provided access to the sea and potential naval support. On August 28, 1189, Guy's main army descended from the Torren and established siege lines around Acre. This act marked the beginning of what would become one of the longest and most brutal sieges of the medieval period. The siege of Acre had begun, setting the stage for an epic confrontation that would draw armies from across Europe and the Middle East. When news of the siege reached Saladin, he immediately began gathering reinforcements. Messages went out across his empire, summoning warriors from Mosul, Sinyar Diyar, Acre, and countless other cities and regions. The Sultan understood that the fate of his entire empire might depend on the outcome at Acre. From his vantage point on the Torren, Guy watched with growing apprehension as Muslim reinforcements gradually appeared on the horizon. Day by day, army grew larger, while Christian morale began to waver. Prayers for divine assistance echoed through the Christian camp as the full magnitude of their challenge became apparent. On August 30th, Saladin established his own camp at Tel Kazan, positioning his forces in a vast crescent around the Christian siege lines. His left wing extended across the Belus River, while his right stretched to Tel el-Ayadiyah. In front of his main battle lines, he positioned a mobile advance guard with orders to harass the Crusader perimeter daily and prevent any attempt to break the encirclement. Guy's army now found itself in an unprecedented tactical situation. Besiegers who were themselves besieged, trapped between the defenders of Acre and Saladin's relief army, the Christians faced the very real possibility of annihilation. Yet Guy was determined to maintain the siege, believing that success at Acre would restore his tattered reputation and legitimize his claim to the throne of Jerusalem. On September 1st, before the bulk of Saladin's army could fully deploy, Guy launched a desperate assault on Acre's walls. Since his siege engines were not yet complete, he was forced to rely primarily on infantry attacks. Christian soldiers rushed forward with scaling ladders, attempting to climb the city's formidable defenses while defenders rained arrows, stones, and other projectiles down upon them. For a brief moment, it appeared the assault might succeed. Christian warriors actually managed to reach the ramparts, engaging in fierce hand-to-hand combat with the defenders. However, the attack was soon abandoned when messengers brought word of Saladin's approaching main army. Guy reluctantly ordered his forces to fall back, knowing that a prolonged assault would leave them vulnerable to attack from behind. Fortunately for the Christians, reinforcements were approaching from the sea. In mid-September, a fleet carrying Danes, Welsh, and Cornish warriors arrived at Acre's harbour. The sight of these foreign banners provided a tremendous boost to Christian morale. A day later, an even larger fleet appeared on the horizon. This second naval force, led by James of Avon, Lord of Conde and Guise, was truly impressive. 50 ships strong, it carried between 12 and 14,000 fighting men from Flanders, Frisia, Germany, and Brittany. James, an experienced military commander, immediately took control of the Crusader army's field operations, sometimes sharing this responsibility with Ludwig III, Landgrave of Thuringia. Near the end of September, additional reinforcements arrived. From Tyre itself, Conrad of Montferrat, apparently recognizing that the fate of all Christian holdings in Palestine depended on the outcome at Acre, brought a substantial force, including Gerardo, Bishop of Ravenna. The rivalry between Conrad and Guy was temporarily set aside in the face of their common danger. The Christian naval presence had grown so formidable that their masts, clustered in Acre's harbour, reminded one Muslim observer of tangled thickets. This maritime dominance would prove crucial in maintaining Christian supply lines during the long siege ahead. Muslim estimates placed the total Crusader force at approximately 2,000 cavalry and 30,000 infantry, a massive army by the standards of medieval warfare. Saladin, recognizing the growing strength of the Christian position, decided it was time to test their resolve. On the morning of September 14th, he launched a major assault on the Christian siege lines. His strategy was to punch a hole through the Crusader defences and drive straight through to relieve the garrison of Acre. The attack began with a thunderous charge by Saladin's elite cavalry units. Muslim horsemen, their weapons glinting in the morning sun, crashed into the Christian lines with tremendous force. For a moment, it appeared the Crusader position might collapse entirely. However, the Christians had learned hard lessons from their previous defeats and were better prepared than Saladin had anticipated. The Crusader infantry, protected by hastily constructed earthworks and wooden palisades, held firm against the initial assault. Their crossbowmen, positioned behind the front lines, sent volleys of deadly bolts into the ranks of the attacking cavalry. Meanwhile, Christian knights, held in reserve, waited for the optimal moment to launch their own counterattack. Despite the ferocity of the Muslim assault, the Christian lines held. Saladin's cavalry, having failed to achieve a breakthrough, began to probe for weaknesses elsewhere. They discovered a vulnerable point north of the city and concentrated their attack there. After an hour of desperate fighting, the Christians were finally driven back from this position. However, the Crusader retreat was only temporary, quickly reforming their battered ranks. They created a defensive formation mixing crossbowmen with mounted lancers and foot soldiers. This combined arms approach, representing an evolution in medieval military tactics, proved highly effective. Within hours, the Christians had not only halted the Muslim advance, but had actually regained much of the ground they had initially lost. After 2 days of intense fighting, Saladin was forced to acknowledge that he could not break the Crusader siege lines through direct assault. Instead, he adopted a strategy of counter-encirclement, extending his own lines to create a siege of the besiegers. His cavalry maintained communication with the city and provided a supply corridor, but they could not prevent the steady stream of Christian reinforcements arriving by sea. These naval reinforcements brought more than just fighting men. The heavy ships also carried timber and skilled craftsmen for constructing the massive siege. Engines that would be needed to breach Acre's walls. Stone-throwing trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers began to take shape in the Christian camp. More alarming news reached Saladin when he learned that Frederick Barbarossa had arrived in Constantinople with an army reportedly numbering 200,000 men. Even allowing for medieval exaggeration, this represented a threat of unprecedented magnitude. The elderly German emperor was methodically advancing through Anatolia, defeating Turkish forces and capturing cities along the ancient military roads that led to the Holy Land. Desperate to counter this new threat, Saladin sent urgent messages to emirs and caliphs throughout the Muslim world, begging for additional troops and resources. To his dismay, the response was disappointing. Many of his vassals, fearing that Barbarossa might attack their own territories, began withdrawing their forces from the siege of Acre to defend their homelands. With their confidence bolstered by successful defensive actions and continuing reinforcements, the Crusaders under Guy decided to take the offensive. On the morning of October 4th, 1189, they launched a major assault designed to break through Saladin's lines and capture the Muslim camp at Tel al-Adiyah. The Christian battle formation was carefully planned and represented the culmination of decades of experience in Eastern warfare. The army was arranged in 3 main divisions: left wing, center, and right wing. In each division, archers and crossbowmen formed the first line, heavy infantry the second, and cavalry the third. This layered approach was designed to maximize the effectiveness of each type of troops while providing mutual support. Conrad of Montferrat commanded the left wing, which consisted primarily of Italian troops supported by men from various other regions. His force advanced along the coastline, where naval support might be available if needed. Gerardo of Ravenna, the bishop who had accompanied Conrad from Tyre, provided spiritual encouragement to these warriors. The right wing, extending inland toward the Belus River, was led by Guy himself. This division included the elite Knights Hospitaller, along with Italian and French infantry and missile troops. The center of the Christian army was positioned near a mosque called Anbak, just outside Acre's walls, and was commanded by Andrew of Brienne and Ludwig III, the famous Gerard of Rydford, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, led the center's vanguard, while Catalan and German foot soldiers formed the front ranks. Remaining in the main camp as a reserve force was Guy's brother, Geoffrey of Lusignan, accompanied by James of Avesnes and his seasoned troops. This reserve would prove crucial if the main assault encountered difficulties or if the Acre garrison attempted a sortie. Opposing this Christian host were the carefully arranged divisions of Saladin's army. On the Muslim right wing, positioned by the sea, stood the Sultan's nephew, Taqi al-Din, commanding some of the finest cavalry in the Islamic world. Near him were Saladin's own sons, Olavdel and Al-Sahir, leading their personal retinues and troops from throughout the Ayyubid domains. The rest of the Muslim right wing consisted of soldiers from Mosul, led by the Lord of Hizan Kaffa, representing the eastern regions of Saladin's empire. These were veteran troops, hardened by years of warfare against the Crusader states and the fractious politics of Muslim Syria. The Muslim left wing presented an even more diverse array of fighting forces. On the far left, near the Belus River, stood a company from Asadea, along with the Mamluks of Asad al-Din Shirkuh, Saladin's deceased uncle and predecessor as ruler of Egypt. These slave soldiers, trained from childhood in the arts of war, represented the elite of Muslim military forces. The near left of the Muslim army included soldiers from Sinjar, led by Mujahid al-Din Urankwa, along with additional Mamluk units and soldiers commanded by Muzaffar al-Din. Scattered throughout were various Kurdish tribal groups. Emir Muyali led the Marani and Hakkari Kurds, while other chiefs commanded their traditional followers. In the center of this vast host rode Saladin himself, surrounded by his regular troops and a personal guard of military slaves. The Sultan's presence served not only as tactical command center, but as a source of inspiration for his diverse army. Each wing of the Muslim force was protected by a thin line of skirmishers, designed to disrupt enemy formations and provide early warning of attacks. The battle commenced at 9 o'clock in the morning when the advancing Crusaders encountered the Muslim advance guard. The Christians quickly dispersed these forward troops, and the elite knights, Templar and Hospitaller, charged through the enemy infantry and missile troops with devastating effect. However, the main Muslim army was not so easily overcome. Fighting continued for 4 grueling hours without decisive result. Both armies demonstrated the military sophistication that characterized warfare in the later 12th century. The Muslims employed their traditional tactics of feigned retreats and rapid charges, while the Christians maintained their disciplined formations and made effective use of their CROSSBOWMEN. The turning point came in the afternoon when the Italian troops on the Christian left wing managed to push forward into the Muslim right. Taqi al-Din, commanding the Muslim forces in this sector, ordered his men to pull back in what appeared to be a tactical withdrawal designed to lure the Christian wing away from the main army. Saladin, observing his nephew's movement from his position in the center, misinterpreted the situation. Assuming that Taqi al-Din was in genuine difficulty, he dispatched reinforcements from his own center to assist the Muslim right wing. This proved to be a critical error in judgment. The transfer of troops from Saladin's center created a dangerous gap in the Muslim line. The Crusaders in the center and right, observing this weakness, immediately pressed forward. Christian cavalry charged boldly into the thinning Muslim ranks, while foot soldiers maintained steady pressure behind the mounted knights. The simultaneous advance of Christian infantry and cavalry crumbled the second line of Muslim defenders. A general rout began to develop, with troops from the Muslim right fleeing toward Tel al-Adeja. Those from the center scattered in multiple directions, some toward Kawana, others across the bridge to Tiberias, and still others taking the long road toward Damascus. Muslims who attempted to maintain their positions were cut down by the advancing Christians. Others were caught at their tents and killed there. For a brief moment, it appeared that Saladin's entire army might disintegrate, potentially ending Muslim resistance in the region. However, at this critical juncture, the Crusaders made a fateful decision that would ultimately cost them victory. The Christian warriors who had broken into the Muslim camp chose to halt their pursuit and instead began looting the enemy tents. Driven by both greed and hunger after months of siege conditions, they abandoned their military objectives in favor of immediate material gain. This decision brought the Christian advance to a complete halt, dissipating all the momentum they had gained through their successful assault. Meanwhile, Saladin, accompanied by only a small group of personal retainers, worked frantically to rally his scattered forces. He rode among the Mamluks and Kurds of his left wing, urging them to turn and rejoin the battle, while simultaneously attempting to reorganize the fleeing remnants of his center. It was at this moment that the Acre garrison, which had remained relatively inactive throughout the day's fighting, finally emerged from the city to join the battle. The Christian looters, busy feasting and pillaging in the Muslim camp, suddenly found themselves facing fresh enemy troops advancing from the city walls. Saladin seized this opportunity with the tactical brilliance that had made him the most feared Muslim commander of his generation. He sent his rallied forces forward into the now disorganized Christian ranks. His left wing, which had remained largely intact throughout the day, engaged the scattered Christian troops, while the reorganized remnants of his center struck from another direction. The Christian forces, caught in the midst of their looting, were unable to reform their battle lines quickly enough, Many were literally caught in the tents, weighed down by their plunder, and unable to fight effectively. Those who attempted to flee found themselves pursued by Muslim cavalry, who cut them down from behind. As Saladin's left wing rolled up the Christian center, the remaining Crusader forces broke completely and fled in panic toward Acre. Muslim horsemen followed close behind, turning what had begun as a Christian victory into a devastating defeat. The situation worsened when the Christian left wing, having faced increasing pressure throughout the day, finally succumbed and began its own retreat toward the main camp. This allowed Taqi al-Din's forces on the Muslim right to wheel around and strike the retreating Christians in the flank, creating a classic pincer movement. What followed could only be described as a massacre. The battle had turned completely, and the surviving Christians fled toward Acre in a chaotic mass, their enemies. In close pursuit, Saladin's men reached the very outskirts of the Christian camp, nearly capturing the Crusader base entirely. However, instead of pressing their advantage, the Muslims withdrew from the field after Geoffrey of Lusignan's reserve force arrived to bolster the shaken Christian ranks. The casualties from this October battle were staggering by medieval standards. Various sources provide different figures, but historians estimate that approximately 7,000 Muslim and 10,000 Crusader troops perished in this single day of fighting. The gruesome clash of October 4th, 1189, demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of medieval warfare. Following their devastating defeat, the Crusader leadership faced a harsh reality. There was little chance of quickly breaking through either Saladin's lines or Acre's walls. They ordered their troops to dig in for what was clearly going to be a prolonged siege, perhaps lasting many months or even years. The Christian camp received some breathing room when Saladin's army began rearranging itself to establish more permanent positions. Additional sea reinforcements arrived at the end of October, including numerous barons and 400 Danish warriors accompanied by a nephew of King Canute, Vi. These fresh troops provided both additional fighting strength and a boost to Christian morale. The Crusaders now constructed more sophisticated defenses around their camp. They dug protective ditches on both sides of their encampment, filling these with sharpened stakes and metal spikes that ran the entire length of the camp from the bay to the open sea. These trenches were fronted by earthen ramparts and wooden palisades, creating a formidable defensive system. As autumn gave way to winter, nature itself seemed to side with the Muslim defenders. Rain squalls and heavy mists heralded the coming of harsh weather conditions. The winter of 1189 to 1190, while not characterized by snow, brought winds strong enough to blow away tents positioned on the exposed heights of the Tauron. More seriously, the rough sea conditions made it impossible for Christian ships to remain anchored safely in the harbor. Most of the fleet departed at the end of October, either returning to their home ports or seeking safer anchorage elsewhere. Some ships were even broken up to provide fuel for campfires as the Christians struggled to survive the winter. Inside Acre, the situation was becoming equally desperate. Cut off from regular supplies by the Christian blockade and suffering under winter weather conditions, the starved and desperate garrison opened secret negotiations with the Crusaders. The terms they proposed were simple. They would surrender the city in exchange for their lives and safe passage. However, the Christian leadership, still dreaming of a glorious military victory, foolishly declined this offer. Their decision to continue the siege rather than accept surrender would prove costly in the months ahead. Fortunately for Acre's garrison, relief was approaching from an unexpected direction. Hossam ad-Din Lulu, a daring Armenian Muslim admiral in Saladin's service, recognized an opportunity to break the Christian naval blockade during the winter storms. The rough seas that had driven away the Crusader fleet also provided cover for a bold relief expedition. On December 17th, 1189, Lulu led 50 Egyptian galleys into Acre's harbour in a daring nighttime operation. Using the fearsome incendiary weapon known as Greek fire, his ships brushed aside the few Crusader vessels that attempted to engage them. The sight of the arriving fleet caused tremendous celebration among Acre's defenders, who had feared they might be abandoned to their fate. The stalemate that followed would last for months. Both armies settled into winter quarters, engaging in occasional skirmishes but avoiding major confrontations. The siege had evolved into a war of attrition, with both sides hoping that time and external developments would eventually tip the balance in their favor. The deadlock finally ended on Easter Sunday, March 25th, 1190, when a new Crusader fleet appeared off the Mediterranean coast. 50 vessels from Tyre, led by Conrad of Montferraty himself, were sailing south toward Acre. The rivalry between Guy and Conrad had temporarily been set aside, and Conrad was bringing reinforcements to support the siege. Before the new fleet could safely reach Acre's harbour, it was intercepted by Muslim ships. A fierce naval battle ensued, lasting for the better part of the day. Both sides employed Greek fire, while volleys of arrows and crossbow bolts were exchanged between the opposing vessels. The Christians ultimately managed to drive off the Muslim fleet and deliver badly needed supplies and reinforcements to Guy's camp. Fresh Crusader troops continued to arrive throughout March and April, allowing Guy to stage surprise attacks that disrupted Saladin's supply lines and further isolated the defenders of Acre. The balance of power was slowly shifting in favor of the Christians, though the siege was far from over, as the soggy ground of spring dried out under the warm summer sun. The Crusaders began construction of massive siege engines. Using timber brought by Italian merchant ships, they built siege towers that rose 4 stories high and could accommodate up to 500 men each. These movable towers loomed as high as Acre's walls themselves, representing a significant escalation in siege technology. The towers were covered with hides soaked in vinegar and urine, substances that the Crusaders believed provided protection against the defenders' Greek fire. Whether this crude chemical defense was actually effective remains debatable, but it demonstrates the innovative thinking that characterized medieval siege warfare. The sight of these colossal siege engines struck fear into the hearts of Acre's garrison. Recognizing that their situation was becoming increasingly hopeless, they entered into a second round of negotiations with the Crusaders. Once again, however, the Christian leadership refused their offers of surrender, convinced that their siege engines would deliver the glorious victory they craved. On May 5th, 1190, the Crusaders launched their assault using the completed siege towers. As the massive structures rumbled forward on their wooden wheels, archers positioned on the platforms engaged in deadly duels with Muslim bowmen stationed on the city walls. Meanwhile, thousands of Christian peasants and camp followers worked frantically to fill the city's defensive moat with rocks and bundles of brush, creating a path for the towers to cross the obstacle. The first tower successfully deployed its bridge onto the city's parapet. Crusader warriors poured out onto the walls, engaging the defenders in fierce hand-to-hand combat. For a moment, it appeared that the assault might succeed where previous attempts had failed. However, the defenders had prepared a devastating response. Loading their artillery with specially designed explosive jars filled with Greek fire, they targeted the wooden siege towers with deadly accuracy. All 3 towers caught fire almost simultaneously, the flames spreading rapidly through their timber construction. The wooden structures creaked ominously as the fire consumed their supports. One by one, the towers collapsed, killing everyone trapped inside in the most horrible manner possible. Those Crusaders who had managed to reach the walls from the first tower were subsequently cut down and their bodies thrown from the ramparts. The May 5th assault had failed miserably, costing the Christians hundreds of lives and months of preparation. The sophisticated siege engines that had represented their best hope for victory had been reduced to smouldering ruins in a matter of hours. Throughout June, the two armies clashed repeatedly for 8 successive days. The summer heat made conditions nearly unbearable, baking the growing mounds of bodies that piled up around the siege lines and city walls. Thick clouds of flies swarmed around the dead, while disease began to spread through both the Christian and Muslim camps. For nearly a month after these intense battles, little significant action took place. Both armies were exhausted by their exertions and weakened by disease and poor sanitation conditions. The siege had settled into a grinding war of attrition that favored neither side. Frustrated by the stalemate, Crusader commanders decided to attempt another major assault. On St. James' Day, July 25, 1190, they launched an attack designed to break through the Muslim lines north of Acre. Their goal was to punch a hole in Saladin's encirclement and potentially capture part of his camp. The initial shock of the Christian assault caught Saladin's forces off guard. The Muslim troops seemed to be slightly out of formation, possibly due to complacency after months of static siege warfare. Christian peasant soldiers armed with pikes and axes pushed forward enthusiastically, believing they might finally achieve the breakthrough that had eluded them for so long. However, this apparent Muslim disorganization was actually part of a carefully planned trap. As the poorly trained Christian infantry pushed forward, Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, deliberately lured them deeper into the Muslim camp. The attackers, following their pattern from previous assaults, soon abandoned their military objectives and began looting the enemy tents. Saladin then sprung his trap, sending Egyptian and Mosuli reinforcements to surround the scattered Christian forces. The attack had been poorly coordinated from the beginning, with only a few dozen knights joining the assault. This small mounted force was led by Ralph de Houterive, Archdeacon of Colchester, one of the few high-ranking clerics to participate directly in combat operations. The attacking contingent now faced the very real possibility of complete annihilation. Ralph and his armored knights attempted to carve a path through the Muslim lines to escape the encirclement, but the damage to the Crusader forces was catastrophic. Up to 9,000 Christians fell in this failed attack, including Ralph himself, who died fighting alongside his men. 3 days later, on July 28th, the arrival of fresh reinforcements provided some consolation for this disaster. Henry of Champagne appeared with 10,000 new troops, representing the advance guard of a massive French army that was making its way to the Holy Land under King Philip II of France. By the fall of 1190, additional English forces had arrived under Baldwin, Archbishop of Canterbury. These newcomers brought word that King Richard I of England had also embarked for the Holy Land and could be expected to arrive, with substantial reinforcements in the near future. However, devastating news also reached the siege camp during this period. Frederick Barbarossa, the mighty German emperor whose approaching army had struck fear into Muslim hearts throughout the region, had died on June 10th while crossing a shallow river in Armenia. Although leadership of the German expedition passed to his son Frederick of Swabia, the psychological impact of the emperor's death was enormous. Many German nobles immediately abandoned the crusade and returned to Europe. Those who remained under the Duke of Swabia faced tremendous hardships as they struggled through Anatolia, harassed by Muslim Seljuk and Kurdish tribesmen, weakened by famine and disease. The once mighty German army gradually disintegrated. Only about 5,000 survivors of Barbarossa's great expedition eventually reached Tripoli, finally arriving at the Siege of Acre in October 1190. Their arrival provided some additional manpower, but it was a pale shadow of the massive force that had originally set out from Germany. Back at Acre, Henry of Champagne spent several weeks attempting various assaults on the city using battering rams and scaling ladders. However, Crusader fortunes continued to decline as Muslim sorties from Acre's gates destroyed many of Henry's siege engines. In early September, the Christian fleet in the harbour launched its own attack during this period. On September 24th, they sent explosive ramming vessels against the Tower of Flies, a fortification that protected Acre's harbour entrance. The plan was to destroy this obstacle and gain better access to the port facilities. Just as the fireships were about to collide with their target, the wind suddenly shifted direction. The explosive vessels began colliding with each other instead of their intended target, creating chaos and confusion in the harbour. Taking advantage of this confusion, small Muslim raiding ships launched a sortie of their own, with thick black smoke engulfing the harbour. The Muslim raiders passed virtually unnoticed through the chaos. Their target was a heavily fortified Pisan ship that had been specially constructed for siege operations. The raiders succeeded in setting this valuable vessel ablaze without opposition, dealing another blow to Christian naval capabilities. By the time the Christians realized what was happening, the Muslim sortie had already accomplished its mission and withdrawn safely. This incident marked the end of Christian naval supremacy at Acre, as the early onset of cold weather made further naval operations impractical. Throughout the brutal winter of 1192-91, plague and famine ravaged the Crusader camp. Intestinal fever claimed thousands of troops who huddled together in makeshift shelters outside Acre's walls, desperately trying to survive the frigid conditions. The contrast between their situation and the relative comfort of the defenders inside the city could not have been more stark. Henry of Champagne himself fell victim to the epidemic, barely clinging to life as disease swept through the Christian ranks. Frederick of Swabia, the last link to Barbarossa's great expedition, succumbed to malaria and died on January 20th, 1191, further demoralizing the German contingent. Food supplies dwindled to virtually nothing by early spring. Common soldiers were reduced to eating scraps of grass and chewing on bare bones, stripped of any remaining meat. Crowds of desperate men fought over the carcasses of dead horses, with even the animals' entrails being consumed by the famished troops. The siege had become a nightmare of suffering and deprivation. Relief finally arrived on April 20th, 1191, when King Philip II of France landed with vital supplies of grain and corn. More importantly, he brought fresh soldiers and sophisticated siege engines that represented the latest developments in military technology. The arrival of the French king marked a new phase in the siege operations. 7 weeks later, on June 8th, an even more significant figure appeared off Acre's coast. King Richard of England arrived with 25 ships, fresh from his dramatic conquest of Cyprus. His approach was contested by a Muslim fleet that sailed out from the harbour to intercept the incoming English reinforcements. But Richard's superior naval forces fought their way through to join the siege. The relationship between Philip and Richard was complex and often strained. Philip, 8 years older than his English counterpart, believed his greater experience qualified him to lead the combined Christian forces. He preferred to continue the methodical siege approach that had characterized operations at Acre, gradually wearing down the defenders through sustained pressure. However, the Crusader leadership generally deferred to Richard, whose reputation as the Lionhearted had spread throughout Europe. Richard was renowned as a fierce warrior who led his men in close, hand-to-hand combat, and his aggressive tactical approach offered the promise of quicker results than Philip's more cautious strategy. Richard immediately identified his primary target, a fortification known as the Cursed Tower, located at the northeast corner of Acre's walls. He positioned his most powerful siege engine, a massive trebuchet, nicknamed Bad Neighbor, along with a heavy catapult owned by the Knights Hospitallers called the Strewn Thrower. To concentrate their fire on this structure, the bombardment began on June 14th with devastating effect. The Templars focused their artillery on the eastern walls, while the Duke of Burgundy's catapults targeted the northern coastal fortifications. Richard's own siege engines soon joined this relentless barrage, though both he and King Philip were temporarily bedridden with illness. The Crusader stone throwers lobbed massive projectiles not only at the walls but also into the city's market areas, terrorizing the civilian population and disrupting normal life within Acre. The psychological impact of this bombardment was as important as the physical damage it inflicted. Finally, the concentrated fire from the Hospitaller artillery achieved a significant breakthrough, demolishing a 30-square-foot section of wall adjacent to the cursed tower. This breach represented the first major structural damage to Acre's defenses since the siege had begun nearly 2 years earlier. Late June saw continued light skirmishing outside the city as Saladin's advance guard probed the Crusader rear defenses. Meanwhile, the Christians maintained their relentless bombardment, steadily weakening Acre's fortifications with their stone-throwing engines. Muslim hopes for relieving the siege continued to fade. Even as Saladin received additional reinforcements in his camp, the situation for the Muslim defenders deteriorated further when the Christians began launching coordinated assaults on the weakened walls starting July 2nd. Richard organized round-the-clock attacks, with wave after wave of infantry archers and artillery attempting to exploit the growing gaps in the city's defenses. Multiple attempts to scale the walls with ladders failed, but the grueling operation maintained constant pressure on the exhausted defenders. Each assault came at an increasing cost in men and equipment, but Richard was determined to achieve victory regardless of the price. Meanwhile, Philip's engineers tunneled beneath the city walls, working toward the partially collapsed cursed tower. Their goal was to undermine the foundation and bring down even more of the fortification. The artillery bombardment had already opened significant gaps, and Richard's focused fire strategy was finally producing decisive results. Inside the city, the Muslim commanders committed every available man to defending the breach. The garrison was barely able to fend off the repeated Christian assaults, and their situation was becoming increasingly desperate with each passing day. Saladin made his own attempts to relieve the pressure on Acre's defenders by launching attacks against the Christian siege lines. Despite fierce and prolonged fighting, his troops were unable to break through the ring of besiegers. The Crusaders had learned from their earlier defeats and maintained better discipline during these defensive actions. Swimmers carrying messages managed to slip out of the city to reach the Muslim commanders, pleading desperately for help. A final appeal was sent out on July 7th, but by this point, Saladin's options were severely limited. On July 11th, Philip's sappers achieved their objective when they successfully undermined the remaining portions of the cursed tower. The collapse created an even wider gap in Acre's defenses, further weakening the defenders' position. By this critical juncture, Acre's garrison was too depleted and exhausted to properly man the expanded breach in their walls. In a desperate attempt to stem the Christian advance, they resorted to Greek fire, managing to kill 40 Crusaders on July 11th. However, these would prove to be the last Christian casualties of the siege. As night fell on July 11th, few people on either side realized that the siege of Acre was effectively over. The exhausted defenders had reached the limits of their endurance, while the besiegers prepared for what they expected would be another day of grinding combat. When the sun rose over Acre on July 12, 1191, the siege entered its 653rd day. One of of the longest and most brutal sieges of the entire medieval period was finally drawing to its conclusion. The city's defenders, acting against Saladin's explicit wishes, made the decision to surrender to the Crusaders. The human cost of this epic siege had been staggering. Approximately 19,000 Christian troops had perished during the terrible ordeal, while the city's garrison had lost between 5,000 and 10,000 men. Saladin's relief army had also suffered enormously, though exact casualty figures for the Muslim forces remain disputed. The surrender of Acre marked a crucial turning point in the Third Crusade, but it also led to one of the most controversial episodes of the entire campaign. Richard the Lionheart, frustrated by what he perceived as Saladin's failure to comply with the surrender terms, ordered the execution of 2,700 survivors from the Acre garrison. This mass execution was probably motivated by Saladin's refusal to pay the enormous ransom of 200,400 gold pieces demanded for the prisoners, and his decline to return the piece of the true cross that had been captured at the Battle of Hattin. Richard's decision to massacre the prisoners would permanently stain his reputation in the Muslim world. By the end of the siege, serious rifts had developed within the Crusader leadership. King Philip of France and Leopold of Austria, both angered by various disputes with Richard, made the decision to return to their homelands in Europe. They took their military contingents with them, significantly reducing the strength available for future operations. Richard, despite these setbacks, was determined to continue the campaign. He took command of the remaining Crusader army and began planning the next phase of operations against Saladin. His ultimate goal remained the recapture of Jerusalem, but he understood that this would require first securing the coastal regions and establishing reliable supply lines. The Crusader victory at Acre in July 1191 had indeed paved the way for their advance toward Jerusalem, but it was only the beginning of what would prove to be an even more challenging campaign. While Richard planned his next moves, the Crusaders rested and reorganized in the conquered city of Acre, which was divided into quarters administered by the three great military orders, the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and the newly formed Teutonic Knights. On August 20th, the captive Muslim prisoners from the city garrison were put to the sword on Richard's orders, marking a final, savage punctuation to the long siege. This act of brutality would have lasting consequences for Christian-Muslim relations throughout the remainder of the Crusade. Eager to build upon his success at Acre, Richard began planning in advance toward Jerusalem. His strategy called for first capturing the strategically important port of Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast, which would provide another secure base for future operations. However, he was well aware that Saladin's army, now over 25,000 strong, would shadow his movements and seek every opportunity to strike. With Acre lost and the Crusaders having established a firm foothold in the central Levant, Saladin understood that his primary mission was to prevent Richard from reaching Jerusalem. The loss of the Holy City would be a catastrophic blow to Muslim morale and could potentially unravel his entire empire. The Crusaders' planned route of march presented Saladin with a tactical opportunity that he was quick to recognize. While the Christians advanced down the coastal road toward Jaffa, he could use his numerical superiority to ambush them on the plains north of the ruined castle of Arsef. On September 7th, 1191, the armies commanded by two of the greatest military leaders of the medieval era, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, would clash in what would become known as the Battle of Arsef. The outcome of this epic engagement would determine the immediate fate of the Third Crusade and potentially the future of Christian presence in the Holy Land. With Acre now firmly under Christian control, Richard spent considerable time planning his summer offensive. He carefully studied the terrain and plotted the route his army would take through Lower Palestine toward the ultimate goal of Jerusalem. Two possible routes presented themselves, each with distinct advantages and serious drawbacks. The first option was an inland route that would take the army from Acre to Nazareth and then directly toward Jerusalem. This path would cover the shortest distance but would require passage through rugged, broken terrain where roads ran through several valleys. These valleys could serve as choke points where Saladin might cut off and ambush the Crusader column. Furthermore, Nazareth lay a good 20 miles from Acre, meaning that the Crusaders would have to maintain dangerously extended supply lines, connecting their field army back to their coastal base. This vulnerability would provide Saladin with opportunities to disrupt Christian logistics and potentially defeat Richard's forces piecemeal. The second option called for seizing key ports along the lower Palestinian coast, beginning with the city of Jaffa. By using coastal roads, the terrain would better protect the mounted Crusader knights and their extensive baggage train from the types of harassment attacks that was Saladin's specialty. After capturing Jaffa, the Crusaders could advance to the much larger port of Ascalon, another 30 miles to the south. Richard could then use these coastal strongholds as bases for a subsequent assault on Jerusalem itself. The ports would also permit direct supply lines from Europe, ensuring that the eventual siege of Jerusalem would be properly supported. After careful deliberation, Richard chose the coastal strategy. On August 25th, the Crusaders departed from Acre and began their march across the sandy plain of Haifa. The army Richard led was substantial, 1,200 knights and 10,000 men-at-arms and infantry, representing one of the largest Christian forces assembled in the East since the early days of the First Crusade. The Crusaders carried their own supplies of water and food, anticipating that Saladin would implement a scorched earth policy during their advance. To support his troops during their 130-kilometer trek, Richard arranged for a Crusader fleet to sail southward 3 days ahead of the army, maintaining pace with the land forces along the coastal road. This naval support allowed Richard to ferry additional troops and supplies from the ships to the army as needed. The blistering summer heat made daytime marching nearly impossible, so the Crusaders developed a routine of moving during the cooler morning hours and establishing camp during the hottest part of the afternoon. Throughout this advance, Saladin's army remained in the shadows of the eastern hills, observing the slow progress of the Christian column and waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The Sultan employed a strategy of constant harassment, sending raiding parties of 20 to 30 men down from the hills to attack the Crusaders at vulnerable points along their route. These raids were particularly effective against stragglers in the rear guard, and many isolated Christian soldiers were picked off and killed. The Muslims also targeted the Crusader horses, managing to kill about 400 of these irreplaceable animals. For medieval armies, the loss of cavalry mounts was especially serious, as replacement animals were difficult to obtain in the field. At one point, the harassment became so intense that the Crusader rear guard temporarily lost contact with the main column. If Saladin's son, Melik Lafdel, had possessed more troops at his disposal, he might have been able to cut off and annihilate this isolated force entirely. However, by the time reinforcements could be brought up, the Christians in the rear had managed to rejoin the main body. The Crusaders' movement around the spur of Mount Carmel proved particularly challenging. The difficult terrain slowed their advance and made it harder to maintain contact with the naval forces offshore. Despite continued harassment by Muslim raiders, Richard maintained his disciplined approach, methodically moving his troops during the cool morning hours and resting them during the oppressive afternoon heat. The army successfully passed Haifa and rounded Mount Carmel before halting at a location known as the Castle of the Narrow Ways. From this point, The Christians entered unfamiliar territory as they moved into the plain of Sharon, a marshy region covered with dense vegetation that provided excellent cover for potential ambushes. Muslim scouts continued to monitor Crusader movements from the surrounding hills as the army proceeded towards Caesarea. Meanwhile, the main body of Saladin's forces established camp at Tel Kamen. Despite suffering from painful blisters on his legs, the Sultan endured his discomfort to travel between his various scouting posts and the main camp, personally supervising the surveillance of Christian movements. When the Crusaders reached the outskirts of Caesarea, Saladin chose not to attack immediately. Guided by patience and strategic calculation, he preferred to wait for the most favorable moment to commit his forces. He was also being cautious, unwilling to risk his entire army until additional reinforcements arrived from emirs throughout his sultanate. Saladin remained deliberately indecisive for several days as the Crusaders occupied the abandoned town of Caesarea before continuing their march to a stream 3 miles south called the River of the Dead. The name of this watercourse seemed ominous given the circumstances. Skirmishing intensified after the Christians left Caesarea, prompting Richard to move from his usual position with the vanguard into the middle guard, where he could better oversee the defensive arrangements. Richard briefly halted his army for 3 days, beginning September 3rd, allowing his troops to rest while the Crusader fleet continued to keep them supplied. During this pause, Saladin's army moved into the forest of Arsef, a large woodland stretching 12 miles north of the ruined fortress town of Arsef. The castle itself had been destroyed by Saladin during his conquests in 1187, and its broken walls served as a stark reminder of the Sultan's earlier victories. While the Crusaders rested in their camp, Saladin spent September 3rd and 4th personally reconnoitering their position. He was searching for the ideal location to launch a full-scale surprise attack that might destroy Richard's army entirely. The forest of Arsef provided excellent concealment for his troops, while keeping them within striking distance of the Christian army. It was here, at Arsef, that Saladin finally sensed the opportunity he had been patiently awaiting. The terrain favored his style of warfare, and the Christians would be vulnerable during their movement through the area. On September 5th, the Crusaders broke camp and resumed their march, stopping for the afternoon at Wadi Alf. Not far from the ruins of Arsef, Richard positioned his army in a plain situated between the shoreline and a vast marsh, which would protect his camp from surprise attacks. During the afternoon, Richard sent an envoy to Saladin's brother, Al-Adin, Saif ad-Din, known to the Crusaders as Safaddin, requesting negotiations for possible peace terms. When Saladin learned of this diplomatic approach, he ordered his brother to prolong the talks while Muslim reinforcements continued arriving at his camp. The Sultan hoped to buy time for his army to reach maximum strength. The following day, met with King Richard and his representatives. During these discussions, Richard made the audacious demand that the Muslims surrender all their conquered territories of Jerusalem and return them to Guy of Lusignan. Safaddin was outraged by these terms and broke off negotiations. Despite his brother's wishes to continue the diplomatic charade, nevertheless, Saladin used the time gained from these talks to arrange his forces on the plains south of the forest of Arsef. His assembled army totaled approximately 25,000 men, representing warriors drawn from across his empire. Richard had been anticipating a possible attack by Saladin for several days. Therefore, on the morning of September 7th, 1191, he reorganized his marching columns into 5 distinct battle divisions, each with specific tactical responsibilities. The Knights Templar, under Grand Master Robert de Sable, maintained the vanguard position, joined by a contingent of Turkopol's native cavalrymen who were lightly armed, fast-moving, and specifically trained to counter Muslim raiding tactics. These Turcopoles had proven invaluable in previous eastern campaigns. Behind the Templar vanguard came the Angevins, soldiers from Aquitaine, along with a contingent of Bretons. The 3rd Division consisted of troops from Poitou. These 2 divisions were placed under the overall command of King Guy of Lusignan, despite his checkered military record. The 4th Division comprised English and Norman troops, representing the core of Richard's personal forces. Finally, the Knights Hospitallers and French forces brought up the rear in the 5th Division. Under the supervision of Hospitaller Grand Master Garnier de Nablus, Richard and the Duke of Burgundy rode along the full length of the marching column, constantly urging their men to maintain tight, compact formations. The discipline of the march would be crucial if they encountered serious opposition. Saladin observed that Crusader advanced from his concealed positions, allowing them to move several miles down the road before unleashing his carefully planned offensive. This patient approach was characteristic of his tactical method, allowing the enemy to commit themselves before revealing his own intentions. Richard's scouts brought word that Saladin's army was preparing for an imminent assault. Suddenly, around mid-morning, Bedouin and Nubian skirmishers emerged from their concealment and attacked the Christian formation, to the sound of blaring trumpets and beating kettle drums. The full Muslim army surged across the plain toward the Crusaders. The Battle of Arsef had begun in earnest, with the fate of the Third Crusade hanging in the balance. The Crusader knights and infantry braced themselves for the heavy cavalry charge that was the signature of Muslim warfare in this period. Egyptian cavalry from Saladin's personal division swooped down from the north, attacking the French troops in the rearguard with tremendous force. Simultaneously, Olafdel's Syrian cavalry struck the French line from the east, creating a coordinated assault on multiple fronts. The Knights Hospitallers and their infantry supports suddenly found themselves assailed from 2 directions, fighting desperately to maintain their formation integrity. The pressure of the Muslim attack soon became almost unbearable for the Hospitallers and French. Additional Muslim squadrons from Saladin's left division struck the Crusaders' middle guard in a coordinated effort to pin down the enemy and prevent them from reinforcing the beleaguered rearguard. Saladin personally moved his household Mamluk guard division into position behind Olafdel's attacking forces. These elite slave soldiers represented the finest heavy shock cavalry in the Muslim world, and they were now positioned to exploit any gaps that might be carved through the Crusader defensive line. The infantry in the Crusader rearguard fought with desperate courage to hold back the mounted Turkish archers. Crusader crossbowmen managed to shoot down many of these light cavalry troops, but they were quickly replaced by fresh horse archers, maintaining constant pressure on the French defensive positions. Many of Saladin's horse archers dismounted to achieve greater accuracy with their composite bows, firing rapid volleys into the Christian ranks. As the battle continued, the Muslim bowmen succeeded in killing numerous Hospitaller horses, greatly frustrating the knights who depended on these mounts for their effectiveness. Master Garnier de Nablus sent urgent messages to King Richard, reporting that his lines could not withstand much more pressure. He insisted that the Hospitallers should be permitted to launch an immediate charge to break out of their increasingly desperate situation. However, Richard steadfastly refused this request. His extensive experience in Eastern warfare had taught him that premature cavalry charges often resulted in disaster. If the Hospitaller knights broke formation without proper coordination, it could spell doom for the entire army. Despite the mounting pressure on his forces, the Crusader line continued its slow advance southward. Richard sensed growing frustration among the Muslim ranks at their inability to break through the disciplined Christian formations. This psychological factor was as important as the tactical situation. Master Garnier grew increasingly angry with Richard's refusal to authorize a charge. He shouted over the din of battle, again requesting permission for his knights to attack. Once more, Richard urged patience, understanding that timing would be crucial for success. Highly agitated by this continued restraint, Garnier returned to his embattled rearguard to find his Hospitallers under even greater stress than before. His knights were on the verge of mutiny, shouting, "Why do we not charge them at full gallop?" Garnier had no satisfactory response to their demands. The Muslims continued pressing their advantage against the rearguard with relentless determination. The Christian foot soldiers were becoming exhausted from the constant attacks, and gaps were beginning to open in their ranks as casualties mounted. The mounted Hospitallers behind them were also suffering under the continuous hail of arrow fire. Around this time, Saladin began making his personal presence felt on the battlefield. His appearance among the troops inspired them to fight with even greater ferocity and determination. The Sultan rode back and forth between his battle lines, shouting words of encouragement and personally directing the assault. Some Egyptian cavalry units began turning the left flank of the French and Hospitaller line, threatening to get into the rear of Richard's entire army. However, Crusader infantry rushed up along the shoreline to block this flanking maneuver, demonstrating the tactical flexibility that Richard had drilled into his forces. Master Garnier made yet another request for permission to launch a charge, but Richard again refused. The English king informed the Hospitaller Grand Master that he would signal a coordinated charge by all divisions at the proper moment, and not before. Richard sent word to his officers that the signal for an attack would be given by 6 trumpet blasts. If the Hospitallers charged independently, it would disrupt the entire battle line and create chaos that the Muslims could exploit. Even worse, charging prematurely would give the enemy cavalry time to wheel about and launch a devastating counterattack. The timing had to be precise, and Richard understood this better than anyone. If executed correctly, the Muslim cavalry would be unable to withstand the coordinated charge of the heavy Christian knights mounted on their armored war horses. However, poor timing could result in the destruction of the entire Crusader army. As the Battle of Arsef continued throughout the morning, Master Garnier struggled desperately to maintain the cohesion of his increasingly impatient knights. They were enraged by the loss of so many of their horses, and eager for the opportunity to strike back at their tormentors. Then, without warning or authorization, 2 mounted knights broke rank and charged into the Muslim lines. One was the Hospitaller, Marshal, while the other was Baldwin Le Caron, a knight from Richard's own household retinue, who had joined the fighting in the rear guard. It remains unclear whether these knights mistook 2 blasts from a Muslim trumpet for the signal to begin the Christian counterattack, or whether they simply charged on their own initiative. Regardless of their motivation, their action would precipitate the climactic moment of the battle. Seeing his marshal ride out of formation, Master Garnier faced an impossible choice. He could either attempt to recall the charging knights, leaving them to face certain death, or he could commit his entire force to support them. He chose the latter course, giving the order for all his Hospitaller knights to charge. Some nearby French knights joined this assault, creating a substantial mounted force driving into the Muslim ranks. Upon seeing the Hospitallers break formation, Richard realized that the moment of decision had arrived. It was now or never. Richard gave the order for the rest of his army to join the attack, with the exception of his Anglo-Norman troops, who remained in position guarding the Crusader standard. Richard himself led his household cavalry in a devastating charge into the Ayyubid ranks, fighting personally in the midst of the action with lance and sword. Meanwhile, the Crusader vanguard under King Guy had reached a series of orchards in the northern outskirts of Arsef. The Knights Templar under Grand Master Robert de Sable stood ready, awaiting orders to join the general assault to the Muslim commanders. It appeared as though the Crusaders had launched a perfectly coordinated attack. This impression prompted Saladin to commit his elite Mamluk household guard in an attempt to prevent the complete destruction of his disorganized army. The heavily armored Mamluk cavalry represented the only Muslim troops capable of standing against the mounted Christian knights in direct combat. These slave soldiers had been trained from childhood specifically for this type of warfare, and their intervention prevented what might have been a complete rout. Richard ordered his charging knights to halt after they approached the wooded hills beyond the coastal plain. He feared that his cavalry might overextend themselves by pursuing the enemy into the broken terrain of the ravines and hills, where they could be ambushed and destroyed by reformed Muslim forces. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Saladin gathered his surviving officers and, accompanied by a small company of bodyguards, rode to a tall hill near the edge of the forest. From this elevated position, his drummers beat the signal for his scattered troops to rally and regroup. The Crusader knights reformed their ranks and charged once more, supported by their infantry, to clear the battlefield of remaining Muslim forces and ensure their victory was complete. The Battle of Arsef had ended in triumph for Richard the Lionheart and his Crusaders. The effectiveness of the Crusader heavy cavalry charges had successfully broken through the Muslim lines, proving that Saladin's forces were not invincible. However, the fact that Saladin managed to reform his army and conduct an orderly withdrawal to the safety of the forest of Arsef meant that the Christian victory, while significant, was not decisive. Richard's knights and infantry, exhausted from the morning-long battle, were now free to continue their advance toward Arsif and ultimately Jaffa. The Battle of Arsif had demonstrated that Richard could defeat Saladin in a pitched battle, but it had not destroyed the Muslim army or ended their resistance. Crusader casualties were relatively light, particularly among the cavalry, but the foot soldiers had suffered approximately 700 killed and wounded during the engagement. Muslim losses were much heavier, with an estimated 7,000 men killed during the battle, representing a significant blow to Saladin's military capabilities on strategic terms. Richard's tactical victory at Arsef was significant but not decisive. The Crusaders resumed their march toward Jaffa, while Saladin's army, though bloodied, remained intact and dangerous. The psychological impact of the victory was perhaps as important as the military results, as it damaged Saladin's reputation for invincibility while enhancing Richard's status as a military commander. The Crusaders proceeded to capture the strategic port city of Jaffa later in the month, providing them with another secure base for future operations. However, with the campaigning season of 1191 rapidly coming to a close, it was becoming clear that any drive on Jerusalem would have to wait until the following year. During the fall and winter of 1191 to 92, both sides engaged in diplomatic negotiations and occasional military actions. The opening of possible peace talks between Richard and Saladin marked the beginning of what would eventually become the end of the Third Crusade. Nevertheless, the Battle of Arsef played a crucial role in restoring Crusader confidence and damaging the reputation that Saladin had built through his victory at Hattin 4 years earlier. It also helped cement Richard the Lionheart's legacy as one of the great military commanders of the medieval era. By midsummer 1192, almost a full year had passed since Richard's victory at Arsef and the subsequent capture of Jaffa. The intervening months had witnessed 2 separate attempts to advance on Jerusalem, but both operations had stalled due to inadequate numbers, insecure supply lines, and the emergence of bitter rivalries within the Christian leadership. Although Richard's tactical successes had effectively prevented Saladin from taking the initiative, the English king found himself unable to overcome the fundamental geographical and strategic advantages held by his Muslim opponent. with increasingly reliable reports that King Philip Augustus of France and his own brother John were plotting to seize his Angevin territories. Richard was becoming convinced that the time had come for him to return to Europe. He concentrated his remaining forces at Acre and began making preparations for departure, confident that Saladin had been sufficiently weakened to pose no immediate threat. However, Richard seriously underestimated his opponent's determination and resourcefulness. Unknown to the English king, Saladin had been quietly gathering his emirs for one final offensive, desperate to regain lost prestige and driven by the need to demonstrate that he could still defend Muslim territories. The Sultan was planning a decisive blow that he hoped would drive the Crusaders from the Levant forever. The twin victories at Acre and Arsef in 1191 had put Saladin firmly on the defensive for the first time since his rise to power. The siege of Acre had resulted in the considerable loss of elite troops, sophisticated equipment, and his entire Egyptian fleet. The psychological impact of these defeats was perhaps even more damaging than the material losses. Although Muslim casualties at Arsef had been severe, the greater problem was Saladin's inability to prevent Richard's southward advance toward Jaffa. This failure had caused the Sultan to lose face among his emirs, many of whom began to question his strategic judgment. Compounding these difficulties, Saladin fell seriously ill during this period, depriving him of the personal charisma that had been crucial in keeping his diverse coalition together. Without his dynamic leadership, the complex alliance of Egyptian, Syrian, Kurdish, and Turkish forces that formed his army began to show signs of strain. For his part, Richard was becoming increasingly aware of the deep-rooted factionalism within both the Crusader states and his own multinational army. This internal discord seriously threatened the integrity of his forces and the ultimate success of his mission. He gradually realized that only sustained offensive operations would keep these divisive tendencies under control. However, this was an extremely risky strategy. Richard could ill afford to suffer any significant setback given the precarious position of the Crusaders in the Levant. Moreover, any major military operation would require extensive logistical support from a region that was poorly suited to provide it, or would need to be supplied from Europe at potentially prohibitive cost. The disunity among the various Crusader factions would further complicate any attempt to maintain secure supply lines. Given these constraints, both Richard and Saladin began searching for a quick, decisive campaign that would deliver a knockout blow and force their opponent to accept a negotiated settlement. Richard was the first to seize the initiative. Jaffa fell to his forces without significant resistance on September 10th. Just 3 days after the Battle of Arsef, he immediately began reconstructing the town's walls and defensive moat, recognizing the port's crucial importance as the closest secure harbor to Jerusalem. The capture of Jaffa presented Richard with two strategic alternatives. He could continue south along the coast toward Ascalon and Darum, thereby threatening Saladin's strategic base in Egypt, or he could turn inland and advance directly toward Jerusalem itself, unable to defend effectively against both options simultaneously. Saladin made the difficult decision to raise Ashkelon's defenses and evacuate its population. He left only a small covering force under his son Alafdel in the vicinity, while concentrating the main body of his army at Jerusalem. As discontented emirs and their military contingents departed daily, the Sultan found himself forced to maintain only minimal garrisons at Darum and other fortified positions in the south. By concentrating his personal retinue at Jerusalem and blocking the inland routes to Egypt, Saladin demonstrated his understanding of Richard's most likely strategic objectives. By October 1191, Richard had concluded that an Egyptian campaign would exert the greatest pressure on Saladin's power base. Egypt represented a vast source of wealth and highly trained military forces. forming the backbone of the Sultan's entire war effort. Richard began negotiating with Pisan and Genoese sea captains to assemble a naval force at Acre capable of supporting an amphibious assault on Egypt. However, neither group was willing to risk their valuable ships so close to the end of the sailing season, when winter storms made Mediterranean navigation extremely hazardous. Even more problematically, the powerful French faction within Richard's army, led by Hugh of Burgundy, saw Egypt as an irrelevant objective and refused to participate in such a campaign. Their sole focus remained the recapture of Jerusalem, which they viewed as the only acceptable goal for a Christian crusade. On the other hand, Robert de Sable, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and Garnier de Naples, Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, urged Richard to make a quick decision and press the advantages gained at Acre and Arsef. They understood that military momentum was a fleeting asset in medieval warfare. Despite his better judgment, Richard decided to delay the offensive against Egypt until the following summer. To placate the French faction and maintain the unity of his army, he reluctantly agreed to march inland toward Jerusalem, even though he understood the enormous difficulties this approach would entail. Crusader morale remained high as they advanced into the autumn, but Richard moved with considerable misgivings. Disturbing rumors had reached him, suggesting that Philip Augustus, his former ally in the Crusade, had begun plotting to conquer Richard's Angevin domains while the English king was absent in the Holy Land. It was at this point that Richard opened serious diplomatic negotiations with Saladin. The Sultan, his military forces considerably reduced and demoralized by recent defeats, was eager to explore peaceful solutions. Although both sides put forward various proposals, no immediate agreement could be reached. The Crusaders made steady progress during their advance, and the town of Ramla, located about 20 kilometers from Jaffa, fell on November 17th. However, over the following month, daily skirmishes with Muslim force became increasingly intense and disruptive to the Christian advance. While these engagements rarely resulted in heavy casualties on either side, they had a cumulative effect of exhausting the Crusader forces and slowing their progress to a crawl. The constant harassment, combined with increasingly cold and rainy weather, began to take a serious toll on Christian morale. By Christmas 1191, Richard's forces had covered less than half the distance to Jerusalem, despite weeks of continuous marching. The reality of winter campaigning in Palestine was proving far more challenging than the Crusader leadership had anticipated. With internal tensions within his army rising to dangerous levels, Richard called a halt at Beit Nuba and convened a crucial council of war. The Grand Masters of both the Templars and Hospitallers urged the king to consider the extreme vulnerability of his current position and recommended an immediate withdrawal to more defensible terrain. Meanwhile, the French faction, led by Hugh of Burgundy, continued to demand a further advance on Jerusalem, regardless of the strategic risks involved. This fundamental disagreement about objectives threatened to tear the Crusader army apart just when unity was most essential. At the conclusion of the Christmas festivities on January 8, 1192, Richard made the difficult decision to order a retreat. To minimize the psychological impact on his troops' morale, he framed this movement as a positive advance toward Ashkelon, where they could supposedly prepare for his planned Egyptian offensive. The undefended town of Ashkelon fell quickly to the Crusaders, but Richard's decision to invest considerable time and resources in refortifying it would ultimately prove to be a major obstacle in future peace negotiations with Saladin. After this strategic withdrawal, there was relatively little significant military activity until the arrival of spring. Neither commander was able to embark on major operations during the winter months. though both used this period to address serious internal problems within their respective coalitions. Saladin, for the first time in 4 years, failed to launch a winter campaign due to growing opposition from his northern emirs in the Jazira region. These powerful nobles were becoming increasingly reluctant to maintain their forces far from their own territories for extended periods. Richard spent much of the winter strengthening Jaffa's defensive fortifications, a decision that would prove invaluable during the dramatic events that lay ahead. However, his strategic situation was complicated by disturbing news from England. In late April 1192, Richard received word from the Prior of Hereford that his brother John had successfully overthrown Longchamps, Richard's designated chancellor and regent, and was now ruling England in the king's name. This development made Richard increasingly desperate to resolve the situation in the east and return home to protect his inheritance. Facing this growing pressure, Richard concentrated his forces at Jaffa while continuing to plan his next moves. Saladin, aware that he still lacked sufficient strength to challenge the Crusaders directly, assumed that Jerusalem remained Richard's primary target and took appropriate defensive measures. The Sultan ordered the poisoning or filling of wells along all the approaches to Jerusalem, while simultaneously dispatching first his younger son, Alafdel, and later his trusted brother, Aladil, north to bring the rebellious Jazira emirs back into line. News of Saladin's weakness and the departure of his key lieutenants soon reached the Crusader camp through the extensive intelligence network that both sides maintained. Richard decided to take advantage of this opportunity and resumed his advance, capturing the strategically important fortress of Darum. After a 5-day siege on May 23rd, the fall of Darum was particularly significant because it represented the last major fortification on the route to Egypt. With this stronghold in Christian hands, Saladin's strategic base was now seriously threatened, and the Sultan would be forced to divert resources to defend his Egyptian territories. Once again, Richard found himself faced with the same strategic choice. Should he advance against Egypt or march toward Jerusalem? The debates within his council of war flared up again with the same bitter divisions that had plagued previous decision-making in the absence of any firm diplomatic response from Saladin, who had been pressing negotiations vigorously throughout the previous summer, and with favorable sailing weather available for at least 5 more months. Striking at Egypt appeared to be the logical choice from a purely military standpoint. However, Richard chose to march toward Jerusalem once more, perhaps influenced by the continued pressure from his French allies or by his own desire to achieve the ultimate prize of the crusading movement. This time the army moved much more rapidly than during their previous winter advance, crossing in a matter of days territory that had taken them months to traverse earlier. Even Richard's falling ill with fever could not significantly slow their progress, and the army established camp at Beit Nuba in early June. A few days later, while out on a hunting expedition, Richard caught his first glimpse of the distant walls of Jerusalem. The sight of the holy city must have been deeply moving for the English king, who had spent nearly 3 years fighting to reach this moment. However, the Crusader momentum began to slow once again as the practical realities of besieged Jerusalem became apparent. The army's supply lines stretched dangerously far back to Jaffa, and Richard gradually recognized that he lacked both the manpower and the sophisticated siege equipment necessary for a successful assault on the heavily fortified city. The approach of St. John's Day on June 24th traditionally marked the beginning of the dry season in Palestine, with Saladin having successfully blocked or poisoned most of the wells and cisterns in the area. Richard's nearest reliable water supply was located 2 miles away from Jerusalem itself. A direct assault on the holy city, as urged by the French knights, would inevitably result in casualties that Richard could not afford to lose. Yet, with his strategic options becoming increasingly limited, the pressure to attempt something decisive was mounting daily. On June 23rd, Richard received intelligence from Bedouin informants that a large and wealthy caravan was approaching Jerusalem from Egypt. Recognizing an opportunity to strike a significant blow while gathering valuable supplies, he led a surprise attack that captured an abundance of food, baggage, animals, and camels. The survivors of this caravan raid fled into Jerusalem, further depressing morale throughout the Muslim garrison and civilian population. This successful operation demonstrated that Richard retained the prerogative and could strike at will against Saladin's forces. On July 1st, facing mounting pressure from his increasingly demoralized followers, Saladin convened a council of war that lasted for 3 crucial days. Here, his personal charisma and powers of persuasion proved decisive, as he convinced his emirs to support one final attempt to drive the Crusaders away from Jerusalem. Taking personal command of his army, Saladin led his forces outside Jerusalem's walls for what he intended to be a climactic showdown with Richard. However, as his army moved toward the expected battlefield at Beit Nuba, the Sultan was amazed to discover no signs of the Crusader army anywhere in the vicinity. Richard had made yet another strategic withdrawal, pulling his forces back toward Ramla and abandoning his second attempt to assault Jerusalem. Saladin could hardly believe his good fortune, as the threat to the Holy City had evaporated without a single major battle. As the Crusader army retreated, its cohesion quickly began to disintegrate along national lines. French knights moved north toward Caesarea, while Richard led his English forces first to Jaffa, where he left a small garrison of wounded and sick soldiers, and then marched to Acre along the same coastal road he had traveled the previous year. "Do not be deceived by my withdrawal," Richard reportedly sent word to Saladin. "The ram backs away in order to butt." This message was designed to conceal the gravity of the Christian situation and maintain the psychological pressure on the Muslim leadership. Richard's diplomatic bluff proved effective, as Saladin remained uncertain about Christian intentions. However, the Sultan used the ongoing negotiations about Ashkelon's fortifications as a means of buying time, while quietly gathering reinforcements from Egypt and expecting additional troops from the now pacified Jazeera region. Although army of 7,000 to 10,000 men was now considerably larger than Richard's reduced forces, the Sultan remained cautiously positioned at Beit Nuba, biding his time and waiting for the optimal moment to strike. On the evening of July 26th, Richard arrived in Acre and immediately began assembling a fleet of 36 galleys. He dispatched a portion of this force north toward Beirut, while publicly requesting the blessing of both Grand Masters for his intended voyage home to England. Word of these preparations quickly reached Saladin, who interpreted all the signs as indicating that Richard was preparing to abandon the crusade and return to Europe. Believing that this represented his best opportunity to strike a decisive blow, the Sultan decided to move quickly against the remaining Crusader positions. Throughout that evening and the following night, Saladin's forces moved stealthily toward their target. Early on the morning of July 27th, his army appeared before the walls of Jaffa, where Richard had left a small but determined garrison under the command of various knights and sergeants. Since Saladin's army, composed primarily of Arab and Bedouin cavalry with a small corps of armored Kurdish and Turkish Mamluks, was not ideally suited for siege operations, the Sultan ordered an immediate assault on the town's defenses. The small Christian garrison was caught by surprise, but responded with remarkable courage and determination. The attackers were motivated by the prospect of a quick victory that would restore Saladin's tarnished reputation. But Richard's earlier investment in improving Jaffa's fortifications proved its worth. The initial Muslim assault was beaten back, with significant losses, demonstrating once again the effectiveness of well-prepared defensive positions. More importantly, the garrison managed to send urgent messages to Richard at Acre, desperately beseeching his assistance. Over the next 3 days, the Christians maintained their defenses while praying for deliverance. Meanwhile, the frustrated Saladin ordered the construction of 6 siege engines to accelerate the capture of the port city. By July 31st, these catapults and trebuchets had achieved their objective, battering down Jaffa's eastern gate and the surrounding section of wall. The breach was now large enough for a general assault, and Saladin was determined to complete his victory. "Forward!" shouted Saladin, leading the attack at the head of his elite Mamluk cavalry. A Christian defender later described the terrifying sight of dust rising from the stone walls as the Sultan's charge thundered toward the breach in the city's defenses. Muslim cavalry poured through the gap in overwhelming numbers, quickly overrunning the initial defensive positions. The small Christian garrison, despite their heroic resistance, could not hold their positions against such overwhelming odds. Unable to maintain their defensive line, the Christians broke into smaller groups, fighting a desperate retreat as the battle moved into the narrow streets of Jaffa. Individual acts of heroism could not compensate for the sheer disparity in numbers. After approximately an hour of fierce urban combat, the surviving Christians were driven from the outer defenses. Those fortunate enough to reach the central citadel took refuge there, while others were caught up in the brutal sack that followed the Muslim victory. The assault completely shattered the nerve of Aubrey de Reims, the overall commander of Jaffa's defenses. However, the Christian cause was unexpectedly saved by the diplomatic skills of Ralph, the newly ordained Bishop of Bethlehem. With remarkable presence of mind, this clerical leader negotiated a brief truce with Saladin that would expire at the 9th hour of the following day. If Richard could not relieve Jaffa by that deadline, the remaining Christians would surrender and the city would be completely lost. But where was Richard during this crisis? When news of Saladin's assault reached Acre on the morning of July 28th, the English king immediately sent criers throughout the streets, summoning all available men for a desperate relief expedition. All of Richard's remaining troops answered this summons, except for the French, who refused to participate in what they considered a hopeless venture. That same day, a detachment of Knights Templar and Hospitaller set out overland for Jaffa, while Richard boarded his royal galley, the Trenchemere, accompanied by 6 other galleys and blessed with favorable winds. Richard's small naval force headed south along the Palestinian coast. Unfortunately, both Fate and Saladin had prepared obstacles for this relief effort. Anticipating Richard's response, Saladin had erected numerous roadblocks and prepared ambush sites that successfully halted the overland relief column of military knights just beyond Caesarea. The flower of the military orders found themselves trapped and unable to proceed further at sea. Richard's expedition encountered its own difficulties when the wind died completely after just 1 day of sailing. His galleys found themselves stranded near Haifa, faced with the seemingly impossible task of rowing the remaining distance to Jaffa against unfavorable currents. For 3 agonizing days, fervent prayers from Richard's men went unanswered as they struggled against the elements. Finally, on the morning of July 31st, the winds rose again, providing the divine assistance the Christians had desperately sought. Urging his crews to superhuman efforts, Richard and 2 of his fastest galleys outpaced the rest of his small fleet, reaching Jaffa under cover of darkness. But had they arrived in time to prevent the final disaster? The early morning light of August 1st revealed a sight that must have filled Richard's heart with despair. Muslim banners flew from Jaffa's walls as far as the eye could see, while enemy soldiers positioned on the beach began shooting arrows to prevent any attempt at landing. Suddenly, a priest from the besieged citadel performed what could only be described as a miracle. Leaping from the wall to the sandy shore below, he miraculously avoided the Muslim soldiers who rushed to intercept him, running desperately toward the water's edge. The priest plunged into the surf and swam out to Richard's galley. After climbing aboard, he breathlessly informed the king that remnants of the Christian garrison were still holding out in the citadel, and that the crucial truce would expire in just a few hours. This news galvanized Richard into immediate action. Still only partially armored, he ordered his galleys directly toward the shore. The moment the vessels grounded in the shallow water, Richard grabbed a crossbow, leaped into the waist-deep surf, and charged toward the beach. The astonished Muslims watched in amazement as Richard shot his crossbow bolt, drew his sword, and led a desperate charge up the beach. The heavily armored Crusaders, though vastly outnumbered, pierced straight through the thick formation of Muslim warriors who had not expected a seaborne assault. Although only a small group initially disembarked with Richard, their superior armor and weapons enabled them to clear a path for the additional troops who continued to arrive from the ships. Startled by Richard's audacious attack, many of Saladin's men turned and fled from the beach into the city. With the enemy in close pursuit, the battle quickly spread into Jaffa itself as more and more Crusaders rushed up from the landing site to join the attack. Richard's legendary courage and leadership had inspired his men to extraordinary efforts that seemed to defy all military logic. Back in the citadel, the surviving members of the original garrison could hear the unexpected sounds of battle taking place outside their walls. When they spotted Richard's distinctive lion banner flying from the outer fortifications, hope was rekindled in Christian hearts. As the fighting intensified and spread deeper into the city streets, the defenders within the citadel prepared for one final effort. Their goal was to break out from their stronghold and link up with Richard's relief force, thereby combining their remaining strength. However, Saladin's troops fought with fierce determination, managing to slow the advance of Richard's spearhead attack. Swarmed by Muslim warriors, the English king's small contingent suffered casualties as they ground their way through the urban maze toward the citadel. Some groups within Richard's force became separated in the chaos of street fighting, as men made desperate attempts to stem the Christian advance. The outcome of the entire battle hung in the balance as these scattered engagements raged throughout Jaffa. Eventually, the Christian forces did manage to unite, combining the relief expedition with the survivors of the original garrison. This consolidated force immediately launched a renewed assault that threw the Muslim army into confusion, overwhelming them in the confined spaces of the city streets. What had been fierce urban combat only moments before suddenly transformed into a complete rout. The Sultan, just awakening in his tent outside the city, found himself powerless to prevent the collapse of his assault force. Saladin's entire encampment was swept up in the panic as troops fled in disorder, trying desperately to avoid being trapped within the city. Gradually, the Muslim army spilled out of Jaffa in complete disarray, and it would take several hours for order to be restored after they reached Yaza, a safe distance from the city. As daylight faded, both armies spent a sleepless night. Men on both sides worked frantically to repair their equipment, collect weapons from the fallen, and prepare for the continued fighting that everyone expected would resume the following day. That evening, Saladin was furious in his camp at the unexpected turn of events. Richard's dramatic appearance had completely surprised the Sultan, and he demanded an effective response from his lieutenants to recover the initiative. As a brilliant military commander himself, Saladin recognized that he still possessed significant numerical superiority over the Christian forces. Sensing that a major setback to his prestige would result if he simply withdrew without further combat, the Sultan knew that he had to attempt a counterattack as soon as possible. Over the next 2 days, Saladin carefully planned an operation that would combine both stealth and overwhelming force. His strategy called for a surprise night attack that would catch Richard's forces unprepared and potentially destroy them entirely. Richard, understanding his enemy's mindset, anticipated that Saladin would attempt another assault and responded with characteristic boldness combined with careful tactical planning. Despite suffering from recurring bouts of fever, he divided his time between personally helping to repair the breach in Jaffa's walls and hosting several of Saladin's emirs who came to negotiate, during which he brazenly boasted about his plans to remain in the Holy Land through the following Easter. Richard also welcomed reinforcements under Count Henry of Champagne, who arrived with additional Knights Hospitaller and Templar, along with a few replacement horses brought from Caesarea. By nightfall on August 4th, Richard could count on approximately 55 knights, 15 horses of questionable quality, and about 2,000 to 3,000 skilled Genoese and Pisan crossbowmen. Demonstrating remarkable confidence in his tactical abilities, Richard marched out of Jaffa with this small force and established a field camp on the same ground that Saladin had occupied just 1 week earlier, around midnight. Members of Saladin's elite bodyguard made their way toward the Christian encampment with orders to kidnap Richard himself. This was the first phase of the Sultan's elaborate plan, which called for a diversionary attack on Jaffa, while the main assault eliminated the leaderless Christians in the field. However, fate intervened in the form of a Genoese crossbowman who was walking outside the camp in the early hours of August 5th. This alert sentry spotted the glittering reflection of helmets from Saladin's guards, who had apparently developed second thoughts about their dangerous mission. The archer immediately ran back into the camp, shouting warnings that roused the entire Christian force. Quickly awakening, Richard threw on his mail shirt and began organizing his defense for what would become one of the most famous small-scale battles of the entire medieval period, with his left flank anchored by the fortified church of St. Nicholas, and his right extending to connect with Jaffa's walls. Richard implemented an innovative defensive strategy that relied heavily on his crossbowmen, whom he positioned in pairs, with one soldier loading while his partner maintained continuous fire. Protecting these missile troops in front were infantry, soldiers with lances fixed into the ground at angles designed to break cavalry charges, while each man also carried a small shield to deflect incoming arrows. Scattered tent pegs, half buried in the ground, were positioned to disrupt and slow any mounted assault. Richard himself, accompanied by a handful of knights on horseback, formed a mobile reserve capable of responding to threats wherever they might develop. As the enemy prepared for their attack, he addressed his men with words that would echo through military history. Adversities reveal virtues, just as prosperity conceals them. Besides, there is nowhere to run, so you must stand firm. True men should either triumph courageously or die gloriously. The Muslim army, confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, launched their assault in waves against the disciplined Christian defensive formation. However, they lacked their usual coordinated movements and attacked without the tactical sophistication that had characterized their earlier victories. Wave after wave of Muslim cavalry and infantry crashed against the line of angled lances and fell back before the deadly, accurate fire of the Crusader crossbowmen. Richard demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to appear at every critical point along his defensive line, inspiring his men and personally directing the resistance. The Christian discipline held firm throughout the morning assault. Not a single feigned withdrawal or tactical deception could entice them to abandon their defensive positions and pursue the retreating enemy, which would have exposed them to counterattack. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as the midday heat began to subside, Richard judged that the Muslim assault had exhausted itself. He gave the order for his crossbowmen to advance beyond their protective lance line and commanded his small cavalry reserve to join him in a powerful countercharge. "He was like a giant in battle," wrote one contemporary chronicler. "His body was like brass, unyielding to any sort of weapon. His right hand brandished his sword with rapid strokes, slicing through the charging enemy, cutting them in two as he met them." Muslim morale finally gave way under this unexpected offensive, and Saladin watched helplessly as his army began to dissolve before the onslaught of Richard's tiny but supremely disciplined force. However, the battle was not yet over. As Richard and his handful of knights reined in their mounts after their successful charge, a great commotion could be heard coming from Jaffa itself. Some of the Christian defenders, exhausted by the continuous fighting and overwhelmed by the scale of the Muslim assault, had abandoned their posts and fled to the safety of the galleys in the harbor. Muslim forces immediately took advantage of these departures to infiltrate Jaffa once again, hoping to create a new crisis that would restore confidence to their demoralized army and potentially trap Richard between two enemy forces. With seemingly inexhaustible energy, Richard quickly gathered a handful of knights, men-at-arms, and crossbowmen to address this new threat. After driving the cowards back from the galleys and establishing an armed guard to prevent further desertions, the English king led his improvised force into Jaffa and precipitated another swift Muslim withdrawal. That evening, both commanders assessed the costs of this remarkable engagement. The Muslims had lost approximately 700 dead and 1,500 horses, many of which remained on the battlefield as testimony to the effectiveness of Richard's defensive tactics. The Crusaders had suffered only 2 fatalities and an unspecified number of wounded, a casualty ratio that was almost unprecedented in medieval warfare. Hoping to maintain some semblance of his former reputation, Saladin sent a defiant message to Richard stating that he still intended to capture both the English king and the city of Jaffa. Richard, though seriously weakened by illness and the exertions of the past few days, issued an equally defiant response. Nevertheless, both leaders and their exhausted armies recognized that they had reached the limits of their endurance. Serious peace negotiations began almost immediately, leading to significant diplomatic progress within a matter of weeks. On September 3rd, 1192, a comprehensive truce was finally reached between the two great commanders. Hostilities would be suspended for 3 years, providing both sides with the opportunity to recover from their enormous expenditures of blood and treasure. Under the terms of this agreement, the Christians surrendered their conquests at Ashkelon and Durham, while recognizing Acre as the new capital of what remained of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. Jerusalem was formally acknowledged to remain under Muslim control. In exchange for these concessions, Saladin gave his personal guarantee to protect all Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem and to permit normal trade relations between the Muslim and Christian territories. This arrangement would provide the foundation for a relatively stable peace in the region by September 5th. Large portions of Saladin's army began disbanding and returning to their homes, while other units were assigned to demolish fortifications under Crusader supervision to ensure compliance with the treaty terms. The following day, Richard departed from Jaffa and rode north to Acre for the final time. On October 9th, 1192, he set sail from the Holy Land, beginning what he expected would be a triumphant return to England. However, as history would record, his journey home would prove almost as adventurous and dangerous as his crusading expedition. The truce negotiated between Richard and Saladin endured for several important reasons. Richard's conquest of Cyprus had provided the Crusader kingdoms with an abundant source of food and other supplies, giving them little incentive to expand beyond their narrow coastal territories. For the Muslim world, the moral energy that Saladin had successfully generated when he declared jihad in 1187 was simply exhausted after years of continuous warfare. Moreover, the Sultan's sudden death in March 1193 fractured his carefully constructed empire, with one son, Al-Aziz, establishing control in Egypt while another, Al-Afdal, dominated Syria. The subsequent infighting among Saladin's heirs would not be resolved until the Mongol invasions of the 1250s, which posed a far greater threat to the Islamic Near East than the Crusaders had ever represented. Only a renewed spirit of jihad would eventually enable the Muslims to repel these eastern invaders at Ain Jalut, and then systematically dismantle the remaining Crusader strongholds. On a personal level, the Third Crusade provides us with two remarkable leaders who, despite their profound cultural and religious differences, had both risen to power in an atmosphere of religious zealotry and intense political intrigue. That Richard and Saladin were able to transcend these conditions and treat each other with honor and mutual respect, even maintaining chivalrous behavior toward their enemy, remains one of the most remarkable aspects of this extraordinary conflict. For students of military history throughout the world, the victories at Acre, Arsif, and Jaffa have cemented Richard the Lionheart's reputation as the epitome of courage and charismatic leadership, just as Saladin's triumph at Hattin and his conquest of the seemingly impregnable fortresses of the Holy Land confirmed his status as one of the greatest military commanders in the history of the Islamic world. While many other rulers avoided the enormous costs and risks of prolonged warfare in distant lands, both Richard and Saladin remained committed to their causes despite enormous personal and political pressures. Yet where others pursued obsolete strategic objectives with single-minded determination, both the English king and the Ayyubid Sultan demonstrated the intellectual flexibility to understand the practical limitations of holding Jerusalem and sought creative solutions to achieve a lasting peace in Palestine. It is through their indomitable spirit, their ability to triumph under the most challenging conditions and against seemingly impossible odds, that these two extraordinary men rightfully earned their places among the immortal figures of world history. Their legacy continues to inspire us to this day, reminding us that even in an age of religious conflict and political upheaval, honor, courage, and respect for one's enemies remain the hallmarks of true greatness. And so, dear sleepy listener, as we conclude this epic tale of the Third Crusade, may the gentle echoes of clashing swords and the whispered prayers of medieval pilgrims carry you peacefully into your dreams. Until our next journey through history's quiet corridors, sleep well and dream of the age when lions and eagles soared across distant lands. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful journey through one of history's most dramatic chapters. If this tale has brought you comfort and learning, please take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts about these remarkable historical figures in the comments below, and subscribe to Sleepy Crown for more soothing historical adventures. Sweet dreams, and may history's heroes watch over your rest.